Well, good morning, and welcome to Day 2 of Child Wellbeing in America, a National Policy Forum. I would like to pick up where we left off yesterday. Many of you heard Aisha June's very clear, very bold request, demand, that to counter poverty, we just give money. And that makes a lot of sense. But over my shoulder, I heard America's response. And perhaps you heard it too, God knows, it was loud enough. And America's response went something like this: no. We are not going to give you money, and it's not because you're just a young and foolish child, although you certainly are. And it's not just because we think you're going to use the money inappropriately and we don't trust you to use it correctly, though I will concede, we do believe that. Simply, it's because we don't believe that your humanity comes with any inherent dignity. Unless you are white and wealthy and well-connected, your dignity comes from your capacity as a future producer in the context of a capitalist economy. And until we get to that point, we will ask you to kindly resume your seat, resume being seen and not heard, and be grateful for any crumbs that come your way. Now, I will say I have to admire America for its refreshing honesty. I've never heard it framed quite that way before. But America's response highlights just why this next conversation is so important. We continue to buy into our hype about the rugged individual and the self-made man, and I leave the gender in there intentionally. And the result is that we continue to craft policy around a deeply flawed understanding of the source of human dignity. And so what we need is a reset. We need to consider what we owe to children: provision, protection, and participation, for no other reason than just because they are children. So while we work diligently on policy change, we have to work on that reset on narrative as well. Now, narrative can mean a lot of things, so let me tell you what I mean by it. Narrative is that system of deeply held cultural beliefs through which we filter all information and all stories that we receive to determine what we believe is valid and what it is we are going to reject. Child well-being collides with a number of very deep and pervasive narratives that prevent it from taking hold. Narratives of individualism and the self-made man inform who we believe is deserving and who is not. A narrative of child vulnerability and powerlessness prevents us from hearing young people's voices. So I'm proud to say that CDF will spend the better part of the next year doing a deep dive into that narrative. We're going to be studying the toxic narratives with an eye to activating the values that counter them. The narrative research is clear that the only effective way to negate a toxic narrative is to replace it with a more effective narrative. And that involves such things as systems of language, systems of stories that we want to tell, metaphors. And it involves important conversations like this one that assert children's rights and power and agency, that prompt us to work with young people rather than on young people. And so now, to lead that conversation, I'm honored to welcome to the stage Bishop Leah Daughtry.
Good morning, family. Okay, I'm from the Pentecostal church, so y'all got to really talk back to me. Good morning, family. Good morning. How y'all doing? It was a wonderful event last night. Congratulations, Starsky and the team for a moving and inspirational celebration of joy. And I am so honored to be with you today to have this conversation about children's rights in a democracy. As we talk about democracy, we know we are heading into an election year, 2024, soon upon us, although some of us are voting this year in primaries across the country. And it seems to me, when we talk about democracy and what we talk about the ballot and what we're voting for, it's really important that we remember that our children are on the ballot. It's not just the candidate at the top, it's what the candidate stands for. It's the policies that the candidate proposes to advocate for and to implement. So when we talk about how we want to shape our America, how we want to shape our interactions in this country, in our communities, and around the world, we have to remember that our children are on the ballot. Their rights, their protections, their health, their freedoms, their future. That's what's on the ballot for us. When you think about it that way, we can't afford to sit it out. We can't afford to say that's somebody else's problem. We can't afford to make a hair appointment that day or to have something else to do. We're voting for our children. We're participating in the American democracy every day, whether it's a school board meeting, whether it's a city council meeting, whether it's a march or a rally or a public forum like this. It's for our children. Now, I am happily, joyfully child-free. Have a witness in the room? Yes, yes. But I am the best auntie in the world. Oh, yes, I am. Ask any of I beat my sisters every year. And I have 3 nephews and a great nephew and a great niece, and they go from 2 years old to 35 years old. And even though none of them live with me, they come visit, but they go home. I'm great for a weekend, but I got a 3-day limit, and they got to go back home. I know that every piece of work I do is for them. It's for what my Lauren Joy is going to have in her world when she's 16. What the world is going to allow her and afford her and encourage her to be when she's 21. What my Alexander, who's 2, knows about living and life will be a result of what I do. What my nephews, who've only ever known Barack Obama as president or Kamala Harris as vice president, what just those things mean for how they see the world and how they understand what their ceilings or lack of ceilings are through the narratives that we see and the visuals that they hear on television. I was in South Africa some years ago, and I was with President Clinton, and there was a young boy named Diego. And he came up to me and he said, he was about 8, "They say the president is here." And I said, "Yeah, he's here, he's over there." He said, "But I don't see him." I said, "He's right there, the guy with the silver hair." And he's like, "That's the president?" I said, "The former president." He said, "A white man can be president?" Because in his 8-year-old life, he had only ever seen Barack Obama and Thabo Mbeki. So his world was shaped by the idea that he could be president, because why couldn't he? There was no ceiling because of that visual. That has stuck with me for 10 years. And how we go about shaping our own democracy in these United States is about taking the ceilings off of our children's imagination by ensuring that they have clean air and clean water and good schools and the protections and the safeties and the health care that they need, and that we value them the way we say we do. One of the young people in my church said to me, "Pastor Leah, I listen to all these speeches, and I hear what they're saying, but I see what they're doing." I hear what they're saying, but I see what they're doing. So the conversation we want to have today is about how we take all the words we've been saying and take our belief system and turn it into action to create the democracy that we want, that will give our children the future that they desire and that they deserve. So my conversation partners today, I'm so thrilled and happy and excited, are Adam Benforado, a law professor and activist, New York Times bestseller. We're going to hear a presentation. Ooh, Adam, those socks are good. Alicia Garza, founder of Black Lives Matter, yes, 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 and best-selling author of The Purpose of Power. Monique Miles, director of the Youth Opportunity Forum at the Aspen Institute, and Kyla Woods, American Youth Policy Forum consulting member. Won't you join me on stage? Okay, we hope to have a very vibrant conversation, and we're going to start with Adam, who's going to share a presentation that lays out a framework for children's rights and why it's important to ground these policies within this framework. So Adam?
So yesterday was my day to listen, and there was a similar refrain I kept hearing throughout the day. A call to take risks, to be audacious, to pursue something that might seem radical. And if you nodded along in those moments, this talk is for you. And if you didn't, this talk is for you too. Buckle up. So, what is the purpose of law? What should its organizing principle be? Now, over the years, I've been given various answers to ensure fairness, to promote efficiency, to facilitate the will of the people, to punish the wicked, to encourage grace. Most of these explanations or justifications have been offered with great authority and confidence. I've come across them in papers and lectures, but I've also heard them from my relatives and my students. I've heard them at dinner parties from friends of friends, from police officers, from pastors, from politicians. Some were accompanied by charts, some required books, some were grounded in the thinking of people who had white wigs or wore robes. Some were sponsored by foundations. I never imagined that I, pictured here in overalls, shirtless in my backyard in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, would have one of my own. But I do now. And although I have no wig or robe or foundation, I think it's the best one. The purpose of law should be to prioritize children. Now, in this short talk, I'm going to begin by explaining why prioritizing kids in law makes so much sense, highlighting 4 big reasons to put kids first. Then we're going to look at how children are actually doing in contemporary America with the aid of a little historical comparison. Are they currently being prioritized in law? And finally, I'm going to offer a vision of change, embracing a robust notion of children's rights. So why should the law, all law, prioritize children's well-being? Well, first, prioritizing the interests of children, protecting them from harm, ensuring their needs, granting them standing and voice, is the least costly and most effective way to create the society we all want to live in. As a society, you always bear the costs of addressing problems like poverty, poor health, crime, and the choice is simply to pay pennies on prevention and early intervention in childhood, or many dollars on trying to address ills that have metastasized and hardened over decades. There is no free option. It's pre-K and routine health screening or prisons and triple bypasses down the line. The data is clear and consistent across fields. Don't wait and remediate. Childhood is the window of opportunity. But it's not simply a cost story. When you ensure that kids reach their full potential, you also get all the upside on your investment in terms of lifetime earnings and tax revenue. And you can expect more community-strengthening behavior in adulthood, more home ownership, more savings, more educational attainment, more civic engagement. Now, second, children's rights should be primary in law because kids are canaries in our coal mines. The things that harm kids also harm adults, but kids are more sensitive to the bad effects. So when you make them your principal focus, you intervene earlier and more completely with major benefits to everyone. Tear gas, lead in the water, solitary confinement, car accidents, all really bad for kids, but also bad for all of us. One of the reasons we have such high rates of avoidable illness, suffering, and death is because we have crafted so many of our legal standards, protocols, and practices based on healthy adult males. As a result, anyone who isn't healthy, adult or male, the majority of the population, is put at unnecessary risk. Drawing our attention to children also helps the law avoid the free choice myth that so often derails corrective intervention, liability, and oversight. It's far easier to appreciate the vulnerability of all human beings to addictive products, manipulative marketing, and other situational pressures when our core legal actor is a child rather than a reasonable man or rational actor. No 5-year-old consciously accepts the risk of toxic train spills by living in a house near the tracks. Third, drawing our attention to children can help remind us of our values, offer moral clarity, and promote pro-social behavior. I spoke to a doctor recently who decided to change careers to pursue global health policy for children. And she told me her epiphany moment had come in seeing that photo of Alan Kurdi, that 2-year-old Syrian refugee, lying dead in the sand on a Turkish beach. Looking at Alan, she felt compelled to take action, to reorient her life to aid kids. And she was not alone. That photo is credited with having a major impact around the world on the response to the migrant crisis in Europe. And that aligns with the broader research from psychology on the so-called child salience effect. In experiments, when participants have their attention drawn to children, they show greater motivation to tackle social problems and help people, even those that don't have any relationship to children. What's weird, of course, is that the law generally tells us not to think of the children, that it's a logical fallacy. When you are sentencing that woman to prison, do not pay any heed to the 3 young children in her life. Don't have the debate on gun control right after the latest school shooting, because that will distort the outcome. Fourth, focusing on children's welfare can get decision makers thinking about the long-term health of this country. When you are focused on youth rights, it becomes essential to think of the decades ahead, to preserve resources, to see connections between generations. With elderly leaders dominating every branch of government and many of the other most powerful entities in society, we end up looking at policies and problems very shallowly, spending too much on the present and passing the bill off to our progeny, and not investing enough in the future. This helps explain some of our greatest collective failures, including our faltering efforts to address climate change. Now, the bad news. We're going to get back to good news in just a second. The bad news. is that law does not currently prioritize children. In America, the law often does not recognize children as rights holders at all. Kids are formally disenfranchised, excluded from holding office. Most other empowerment rights over medical decisions, interpersonal relationships, and the like are at best contingent or secondary. They do not have a federal constitutional right to education or health care. Our nation does not guarantee them housing or food, nor does it provide their parents with paid care leave to spend time with them when they're first born or when they're sick. The United States is the only UN member state, the only one, not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In recent decades, the Supreme Court, which might do so much to advance the interests of kids in its role as a counterweight to the popular branches of government, which are dominated by adults, the Supreme Court was set up as a counter-majoritarian entity to protect the minorities who have no voice. Instead, though, it has acted to restrict the rights of children to privacy, free speech, racial equality, and bodily integrity. If you want to predict a pending decision today, a good rule of thumb is to step into the shoes of any children implicated in the case, consider what they'd want, and then go with the opposite outcome. In America, youth tends to be treated by the law as a disability, and a disability that not only requires no accommodation, but that is also rightfully discriminated against. In instances when children have demanded equal treatment to adults, they've mostly been sent packing by the courts. In general, it's okay to treat all kids as unqualified for some freedom, even if the grounds for exclusion don't apply to many kids who clearly exceed whatever capacity benchmark has been chiseled in the wall, and even if they do apply to many adults who are waved past the gate without so much as a second glance. No 17-year-old can vote for president, period. We offer no assistance to address the impediments we assert exist. It doesn't matter how gifted and knowledgeable that teen is. We offer no pathway to the polls, even as we welcome the absentee ballots of octogenarians translated, explained, filled out by helpful aides with no questions asked. In many ways, children in America are viewed as outside of the law. Their interests are not cast as part of the business of the community, so they're viewed as improper subjects for our collective engagement, protection, and investment. Their realm is the family, where they're not seen as our fellow citizens, but as the personal property or perhaps extensions of their parents. Now, this was not inevitable. Indeed, about 100 years ago, it looked like we might be heading toward a golden age for kids. At the dawn of the 20th century, there was a stirring of children's rights activism all across the country that passed child labor laws, created a juvenile justice system, built playgrounds, marshaled resources to protect children from abuse and neglect by their parents, bolstered public education, and pushed for basic health measures. These progressives were advancing an argument that the project of raising the next generation of Americans was a collective one. Society bore the ultimate cost of childhood poverty, abuse, illiteracy, and poor health. And so society, therefore, had a right and a responsibility to better the lives of youth. But over the last century, Americans have become increasingly convinced that the project of raising children, of supporting their proper development, is the sole responsibility of parents, not government. This was a broad cultural shift, but one that got critical support from elite institutions like the Supreme Court, which produced a series of opinions articulating parents' rights to control the upbringing of their children, to, quote, direct their destinies in matters of education, medical care, family relationships, and everything else. And as is clear from the recent news cycle, including the House passing the so-called Parents' Bill of Rights earlier this year, it was this vision that won the day. Now, one piece of the puzzle that I've left out is how our approach to law itself biases matters against children's interests. In sharp contrast, think about this for a second. In sharp contrast to the orientation of science, technology, medicine, and business, which all direct their attention forward, law is backward-looking. Originalism and precedent both operate to prioritize ideas, beliefs, and perspectives from decades, if not centuries, ago. And that can be devastating for kids, because 200 years ago, kids were subject to terrible conditions, oppression, and exploitation. So if you look to, quote, traditional common law concepts, what has always been the law of the land, traditional ideas of fair procedure, and attitudes which our society has traditionally taken to decide if kids have rights, you're never going to find them. As the majority in this case that I quote from here, Ingraham versus Wright, concluded, since something has been dating back to the colonial period, there's nothing we can do about it. So, what should we do? How do we get the law to prioritize kids? Well, in my book, A Minor Revolution, I argue that we can move toward this vision by recognizing a core set of rights grounded in the best available evidence of what children need to thrive at each stage of their development. And because time is tight, I'm going to just briefly highlight 2 examples from the book, but I look forward to interacting with all of you after the session and by email and hopefully at future sessions. I'm just going to focus, though, now on 2 examples. One looking at the first years of life and one looking at late adolescence. So the first example, if we heed the robust evidence collected over decades on the value of attachment between primary caregivers and their young children, we recognize that children have a right not to be separated from their primary caregivers. And then we make changes to the criminal justice system and the child welfare system to secure that right. Specifically, we stop locking up hundreds of thousands of fit parents in favor of monitoring and other forms of punishment that do not hurt innocent children. And rather than remove kids from homes where there are rodent droppings and peeling paint and no food in the refrigerator and no one watching the kids after school, we give poor parents the help they need with good, stable housing, food aid, and child care when they are at work. Now, the second example. If we heed the evidence that shows that adolescents possess valuable insights and experiences with the most pressing issues we face as a nation, that teens possess the capacity to exercise power, and that they will live with the consequences of decisions made today far longer than older Americans, we recognize that young people have a right to a voice in public life. And then we make changes to the law to allow our high schoolers to vote, run for office, serve on juries, and have decision-making power in their schools when it comes to what AP courses they think they should learn about, what books they think are appropriate for them, and everything else. To echo Reverend Dr. Wilson's speech from last night, I strongly believe that giving power, real power to youth, is the best path to producing the meaningful, large-scale change the people in this room desperately want to see. Now, looking forward to the 2024 election, I have some ideas about broad-based changes to government that can help facilitate all of this, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about a little of that in the Q&A. But I want to end my brief talk by pointing out one last benefit of shifting the discussion from help kids because it's good for them to help kids because it's good for all of us. Seeing the value to all of us of prioritizing kids, that everyone in society benefits from a child-first mindset. allows us to ask for far more than we've been asking for. What children need to thrive, not simply what they need to survive. Realizing that it's not a zero-sum game allows us to move away from children's rights minimalism that has tended to frame debates around necessities. How many children are living below the poverty line? How many children don't have enough food to eat? How many third graders can't read? We can and we must ask for more. America's children deserve the best schools, the best health care, the best services for them and for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for that compelling presentation. I'm going to come back to you in a bit to talk to us about how you're defining real power. What does that really mean? But I want to start with Monique, if I can. Given your work at the Aspen Institute on innovative place-based initiatives and solutions, I want to stick with the theme that Adam started us with. What are some of the challenges that are facing young people? If you can he named some of them, and I wanted you to draw that out. What are the challenges that you're seeing, and what are some of the solutions?
Okay, y'all can hear me. So good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
It is such an honor to be here and part of joy. And I am in my body, and it feels so good. Adam, I want to say that your words made me think of James Baldwin. These all are profit from or pay for what they become. So that are quickly this idea of the challenges young people face. Hold it up. Thank you. There we go. All right, all right. So I think first and foremost, where I really want to start is this idea that all of us together in the movement are playing a really integral role, right? If you think about this, each of us as a star and how the stars all align in a broader constellation, it matters that CDF is very much living at the intersection of child well-being and racial equity, because when I talk about the work we're doing at the Aspen Institute, it's a very similar type of mission. Our aim is to support young people between the ages of 16 to 24 who are out of school and out of work to self-determine their futures for themselves, their peers, their families, and their communities. That's the vision of our work. We support 40 communities across the U.S., rural, indigenous, and urban communities, and this is also important because of the geographical diversity. That is also about how we harness the collective power of young people across many different types of places. And at the same time, we believe and we practice this idea that our wealth is in our culture, the identities of our young people, the voice and power of our young people. And so we are always feeding and nourishing that. That is very much our work. And then there are some principles that guide us. So first of all, there's nothing about us without us, which John Powell teaches us is about reshaping, restructuring the table, restructuring systems so that young people's voice and power are at the center of problem identification and solution design. We also have been deeply committed to racial equity, and my point here, y'all, is that when we talk about racial equity, we are deeply committed to all young. And what we know is that in order to get to all young people, we have decided to prioritize and center Black, Indigenous, and Latino young people because of where they sit in a social hierarchy that has decided to devalue their lives, right? So their perspective and wisdom from where they sit in that hierarchical structure gives them knowledge and wisdom about how to design solutions that give them perspective on the all. So when we talk about racial equity, when we talk about centering Black, Brown, Indigenous, we're talking about how to get to the all. We heard this last night, that doing racial equity work, Miriam Wright Edelman, doing racial equity work is doing work for all of our young people. And then the last thing that I want to say is that we also approach this work intergenerationally. We know that there's knowledge from our ancestors and our elders, and that guides us. And we know that, to Adam's point, this is multi-sector, multi-system work. One sector cannot do it alone. It takes all of us working together to accomplish our goals, to address challenges that young people face. They face the challenge of a failing democracy. They face the challenge of intergenerational trauma. Young people have described in our network well-being as the absence of intergenerational racial trauma. So that is a significant challenge they face. We are living at a time of multiple crises. We have a mental health crisis that our young people are facing. We have the climate crisis that young people are facing. Sometimes this generation is called the generation of low-key depression because they are always bombarded with messages of the different crises that they are facing. And then finally, we think a lot about our work as beginning to articulate pathways into adulthood that are deeply committed to building the cultural wealth, the identities, the intersectional identities of young people. And so some of our work is about removing those structural barriers for our young people, because that is also a significant challenge they face. And here's what's so important. When we talk about solutions, what young people are doing in communities across the US to address these challenges, young people are remembering. The first thing that young people are remembering is the history that got us to the moment we are in. They are remembering and understanding the history of policies, racially based policies that have locked their elders, their ancestors out of opportunity, and that is informing how they are organizing for solutions. Young people are also remembering in the body politic. They are reorganizing in ways that help them begin to meaningfully address the challenges that they face. Each of them together are the stars in that broader constellation of remembering, of reorganizing in the movement, the body politic, to get to outcomes that they seek. And then finally, young people are remembering. See, we know this. We know that memory lives in our bodies, right? Memory is passed down from our ancestors, it's passed down from our elders, and it lives. Our bodies remember. So young people are doing remembering in their bodies in ways that help them understand that trauma, but most importantly, y'all, they understand the perseverance and they understand the joy in their bodies as well. And they are receiving that and calling on that from their ancestors, from their elders, from the movements that have come before, and they are bringing that into this work. And the reason why that is so important is because the other thing that young people are doing and remembering is they are able to bring their whole selves, their whole body, their whole identities, the complexity and intersectionality of their identities together in ways that help them specifically organize for racial equity and racial justice. And then what does this look like? This looks like young people starting C3s and 4-3s. This looks like young people getting elected into local office. Everything from school boards to local policies to control the city budget, to how they are able to bring young people into the systems, into the structures to be able to advance social change.
Wow.
We support something called the Wellbeing Project, and this is very specifically young people, again, Latino, Indigenous, and Black young people who are coming together with their peers to not only understand and define what well-being looks like, what well-being feels like, but then what does it mean to be able to organize their peers around advancing well-being, specifically with this idea of we want to, at the same time, redress these structural barriers to opportunity. We also are supporting young people. San Diego is a great example of this, an organization called Youth Will. This is 100% youth-led. They have created a Bill of Rights that is about the entire city of San Diego embracing the type of agenda that Adam was speaking to. Young people identifying their rights, ensuring that the city is going to fund their rights, because that's another challenge young people face. We say that we value their voice. We're not paying them for their time. We're not treating them like the experts there are. We are not making sure that the funding is there to support youth organizing. So the other groups, the youth organizing groups in our network, are also doing demanding the funding to support their work.
So I want to pivot from your point there, because
Yes.
you've given us quite a framework for what's problems are, what solutions might be, and how we build on that. So Alicia, I want to ask you, as one of the preeminent movement builders of our time, Black Lives Matter brought together hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people toward a particular objective, and so many of them were young voices. So in your book, you talk about movement building. What this requires is a movement. What lessons can you share with us about how we build this movement for children's rights?
Good morning. I'm going to pick up a little bit where you left off, because I want to pick up what you was putting out. So, you know, in thinking about this question and what's needed for movement building in this moment, what came to me was this question of how do we fight the amnesia that organizes this country and that organizes our relationship to the rest of the world. So young people are remembering. And the tension, right, is not with young people, it's with us. We are constantly telling stories that are not grounded in reality. They're not grounded in the complexity of our experience, and they don't offer the good, the bad, the funky, the ugly, the not so great, the things that we're not so proud of. And so therefore, we're creating environments, right, where we're gaslighting each other. We think we're protecting young people by telling particular stories about how we got here, what we've been through, the risks that we took or didn't take, right? I remember when I was growing up, my mom, you know, I was growing up in the 80s, and so I thought movements were done, right? I was like, wait, how come there ain't no sit-ins? There's no protests, there's no, well, I'm trying to be a part of that, right? And the stories that I got about movement were complicated, right? On the one side, there was a deep pride in what we had done to secure our rights. And of course, everybody in my family marched with King. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, my mom said, you know, Grandma didn't march with Martin Luther King. In fact, she said, in fact, your grandma wasn't for what King was doing. He was causing too much trouble, in her opinion. And so it was your granddaddy that wanted to do that. And that's where you get it from, she told me. In my 30s, in my teens, and in my younger life, she was telling me a whole different story. So the way I understood the world was really different. Now imagine getting to 30 years old and going, wait a minute now. So amnesia, we are advancing an engine that this country is powered from. And we're doing it sometimes without knowing it or intending to. So the question for us, I think, is how do we tell young people stories that allow for them to understand themselves in a context and to know that they too can make choices and that our circumstances, right, are not the result of superheroes that just magically appeared, but they're the result of people making choices to do something or not do something, and that those choices have consequences. The second thing that I think is important, I'm looking for you, Mike, I'm like, don't lift it up yet. The second thing I think is important for movement building, especially in this context and in this moment, I talk a lot in my book about alliances and coalitions. And you know, one of the things that I think is comfortable is we find people, so I talk about this, I talk about, you know, the first step to change is figuring out what you care about, and then finding other people who care about the same things that you do, and then join them. And then all y'all together figure out what we gonna do. And who's gonna do what. One of the things that we can do is we can find the people who care about the things that we care about, but we can tend toward the people who agree with us on the things that we care about. And the thing about movements is that they involve organizing. Not everybody ends up where they begin, and that's our job. But there's a trick to alliances and coalitions, because there's another side to it. One of the things that we can also do, right, and I think is important in this moment, is we have to build as broad as possible. Okay? Everybody who cares about young people, everybody who cares about children, everybody who cares about the future of this nation and our globe needs to be united. But there also has to be a group of people that are clear about what well-being means and what it doesn't mean. What positive and progressive policy change is and what it is not. And sometimes a thing we can do is we can build the coalition without clarity about what it's for. And so we mistake presence for power, as my brother Rashad Robinson would say, instead of building actual power. Proximity to power is not power. And sometimes we are losing that texture. Just sitting at a table doesn't mean you've set the menu. We aim to set the menu. And so when we're thinking about who are we bringing into these coalitions, we also have to be thinking about what is the role that they're playing. Sometimes we are going to have people in our coalition who generally believe that children should be well, but they believe it from a I want to feel good about myself perspective. I want to give a thing so I can feel good about myself perspective, and that's okay. They should be in the coalition, but they should not lead the coalition. Right. So understanding that texture and nuance is important when we're building, because if we don't, we're not taking control over what is the political and moral center of our alliance, and we can lose control of the agenda.
That's great. Just because you're at the table doesn't mean you set the menu.
Correct.
Nor does it mean you even get to order.
Period. Period.
You might just be there. Seat filler. Seat filler. So Kyla, let me ask you, how do we share your thoughts on how we authentically and meaningfully engage young people and children in this discussion to give them the agency to shape the future, and so it's not a bunch of old people deciding what children's rights should look like?
Yeah, I mean, at first good morning, everybody. I really want to break down this word authentic, right? Because we get real jargony. We get a word and we start seeing it everywhere without fully dissecting what it means. So when we're talking about authentic partnership or meaningful partnership, it's going to take the relinquishment of that power that we're talking about. If you're not willing to release, it's just partnership. It's just superficial. We invited some young people, we got some feedback about our after product, but if you released no control over the implementation, what was going to be looked at, what gaps you were looking to address, you did not do anything authentic. And when we think about partnership, that indicates a mutual exchange, right? So yes, I may be getting access to a new professional landscape, right? I may learn what qualitative data is in reference to my lived experience and the fact that I have tools that I can go back to my community with. But you also have access to so many insights that you would not have. So much, we say data, right? But when we're talking about where to go in a new direction, if you don't know where those pain points are, you waste so much time, so much money. And so the advancement that you end up having when you bring young people in, when you bring folks that have been directly impacted, marginalized, is that you're 10 years ahead of the curve. So what does it look like understanding that investment that we're having? What are we willing to pay back? I think a lot of times when we're inviting folks into a space and we're like, oh, you have this perspective, we want them just to focus on that. And especially when we're talking about young people, typically it's around a specific issue, whether it's juvenile justice, homelessness, trafficking, whatever it may be. We're asking them to speak to the most painful moments in their lives, usually without anything, number one, that they can say in their own words, build power with their peers from what they just learned. So the information just stays with them, and maybe a couple of peers that they meet in the space that you connected them with, but there really isn't that, okay, yeah, they just told me to show up at this event, share a little bit about my story. I don't understand that, no. We provided a new policy agenda. Because if you don't sit down and break that down, if you don't sit down with someone and really help them understand where they sit in that story, in that larger picture, they have no access to that macro. It's just the micro, which is so limiting, which keeps people in a space where they're not able to innovate because they just understand, okay, my ability to help out is to share my story and hopefully it never happens again, versus understanding their ability to see trends that someone who may have professional experience, learned experience versus lived just wouldn't. And so when we think about authentic and being specific about what's inauthentic, it's inauthentic to partner with young people and say, hey, this is our agenda. Exactly, now move it. Now respond to the pain without thinking about what your progress could be. And I have learned so much from the spaces that have done it correctly and done it poorly, because those opportunities, this is a new field. There's a lot of advancement. It was a huge win maybe 5 years ago. I'm turning 26 and pretty soon. And when I came into the organizing space at 19, people were just happy that young people were in the room, which with that table that you're talking about in proximity to power, just being in the space was enough. And you're here, and you know what? You're not on the street anymore. So be happy. Exactly. Everyone's patting themselves on the back. And so now it's wonderful now that we're at a space where there has been enough young people at the table, enough feedback given, probably about some efforts that, while they may have been well-intentioned, didn't fully realize the ability of young people, the talent that they have, the tenacity that they're coming to this space with, that will allow us to just learn from each other. So lived and learned experience, being trained and having mentors and understanding what leadership can look like, it's so meaningful. But then in turn, you've got to be willing to shift, to bend bureaucracy. And I'll wrap up soon, but actually I don't see your mic here. So when you're thinking about that investment on the front end, you can't say, all right, we're gonna figure it out once young people get here. That's not how it works. You have to decide where internally, whether it's an organization, an agency, a coalition, where you are willing to relinquish power. Because otherwise, you are going to spend the first 6 months, first year, grappling over where you are willing, where the system is willing to let young people organize, let young people step into the space, which can be extremely demotivating. And then we ask ourselves, I've had other organizers ask me, why are there no young people at the table? They showed up to the first 5 meetings and you told them what they were gonna do, how they were gonna do it, and then you called it youth-led. And I do want to circle back to that funding piece. It's so real that it's serious, because it's when you are told you are so important, we need you here, you are vital, you're essential, and everybody else is salaried. Everybody else has insurance. Everybody else is fully able to focus and be in the space. They're not thinking about, oh my gosh, I got to run and get to this shift, and hopefully let me organize my brain so much so that I can stretch myself to tap into this space and not expect a career out of it, right? Not expect that that my participation in this space is going to be valued so much that you're going to think about what it's going to take to sustain. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent. My timekeeper has flashed my high sign there. Otherwise, we'd go on and on and on with this robust conversation. And so we've heard a lot today. Adam starting us off with talking about a vision for change and what it means for children to really have rights, not the rights we say, but how are we willing to implement and inculcate those into our daily lives. We heard about remembering. That was really important point, that young people are remembering, fighting the amnesia, as Alicia said, and then giving real power to young people, to young voices, which means relinquishing power and making the table bigger, and how we build coalitions and really build the table in order to create this movement that we need in order to have children be first and foremost, be the first thought, the middle thought, and the last thought in what we are doing. So I'm going to go to Alicia for our call to action. And so much of what you said resonated. I recently just co-authored a book called Religion and the Movement for Black Lives.
Yes. Where can I get a copy?
It's on Amazon.
Okay.
It's on Amazon. And in my chapter, I talk about how you build coalitions with people that are not like you. And using my own experience and the experience of my dad and others. And the fundamental thing was, you don't have to be like me just to be like me. You don't have to be like me to be just like me.
That's right.
And what is the real thing? What's issue number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? And then how do we organize around that, understanding we come with differences, but the differences are what make us stronger.
That's right.
The differences are what make the coalition and the movement move, because we bring different things to the table. But you can't have a coalition for children's rights without children.
That's right.
And without young people. So Alicia, give us our call to action. What do we need to be doing right now? We headed into election season. We got a lot of stuff we got to do. Tell us what to do.
Build power. So we're in a very dangerous moment. And I know we've been saying that for a while, but I really mean it. We are in a moment where democracy is deteriorating in front of us, and I'm not sure that we are ready for what lies ahead. You know, when I first started organizing, people would talk about fascism, and that was like a way to talk about people that you didn't like, or people that, you know, were trying to tell you what to do. It's kind of true. But fascism is really a new order. It's a new way of being organized. And it is a new way of distributing power. And the goal of fascism, right, is to keep power away from as many people as possible. When we see the former president and the people who are aligned with the former president, we're still looking at them going, ugh, I wish they would just go away. Why are they so wild? Why are they so out here? These are stunts. They're not. They're organizing tactics. There are millions of people who are being activated by those folks that we think are outliers, but we have to understand that they have become the rule. They are Congress people. They are winning the White House. They are winning in state legislatures. They are making policy about children. They are not the exception, they are the rule. And the thing that they want is to be the power. and they're close. And they're close. So, my call to action is that we have to fight that. But in order to fight it, we actually have to understand what it is. So fascism is the erosion and the elimination of participation. I've seen over the last couple of weeks how much closer we are based on this conversation about what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and with Palestinians. We could get into a whole conversation about what do you believe, what side are you on, all the things. There's a bigger conversation, actually. And the bigger conversation is, what does it mean that an entire group of people haven't been able to vote for a government since 2006? What does that mean? What does it mean that our nation, that says that it supports democracy across the world, is supporting this conflict with dynamics where there is an entire group of people who haven't been able to vote for a government since 2006? And then what does it mean that in this country, what people want to say about where they think we should be is being penalized and punished? What does it mean that the people who are supposed to be sharing the news with us so that we can make informed decisions are getting lists every morning before they go into work about what they can talk about, what they can't talk about, words they can use and words they can't use? What does that mean in a functional democracy? Those are the things that we should be concerned about. Because if we hope to impact and influence what our country does, we have to actually be able to participate. And our ability to participate is being eroded. That is the thing that we need to be paying attention to. Fascism also looks like the rise of ethno-nationalism. In this country, that means white supremacy. We have right now sitting in our United States government 100 people at least who are elected, who have sympathies at least with white nationalist movements. They're attending conferences, they are flashing white nationalist gang signs. They tried to take over the government. That is the rule, not the exception. Fascism looks like the rise of male supremacy, the attacks on our ability to make decisions about our own health care and our own bodies, whether or not we choose to bring families into the world, attacks on trans people, trans youth. It has nothing to do with bathrooms or sports. And it has everything to do with creating a nation that is governed in a certain way. And then finally, the censorship. What can you say? So the fight against that looks like broad coalitions, not just for children's rights, children's well-being, but for our ability to participate. That's the broad coalition, and inside of there needs to be a whole bunch of people. And there's going to be a whole bunch of people in there that you don't like. A whole bunch of people in there that you don't like and you would rather not rock with, but here's the thing. In order to be able to make the rules and change the rules that we want to, we actually have to protect the system that allows us to do that. And that's going to take a lot of people. It also looks like a fight for a world where we all belong, meaning not allowing ourselves to get pigeonholed into these dynamics that don't allow us to be free. Human beings are not sports teams to choose among. Human beings are not sports teams to be chosen. So, we should be fighting for everybody to be able to belong. Whether or not that's what you want to do or be or how you want to live your life, your fight should be for everybody to be able to live their life as they need to have as much dignity as possible. And then the final piece here about what we do is to continue to fight to protect our voice. We are watching across the country universities, the most prominent ones, saying things like, well, any student that speaks up about this, we gonna make sure you don't get a degree, you don't get a job. We cannot allow for those types of things to happen. If we are fighting for the well-being of young people, we have to also fight to protect spaces where young people get to learn where they stand, who they want to be, and what their purpose is. So that is my call to action to all of us, is to be clear about what's ahead of us and to pick the right fight. Thank you.
Thank you to my conversation partners for your contribution. That's, Alicia, you have beautifully summed up the conversation and what we need to do next. Thank you, Dr. Starsky-Wilson, for envisioning this and for having us. Please give them all a round of applause.